In this video, I want to describe the process of creating a digital illustration for a real-world project. This is an illustration that I created for the Georgia Straight magazine, a local newspaper. Now, the Georgia Straight is a weekly magazine, and as a weekly, it has very tight deadlines. So creating cover work for them usually involves getting a phone call on Friday afternoon, looking for an illustration to go to press by the following Monday. But in this case, they gave me a full week, which was nice because it allowed me to think about this project in a little bit more detail than I normally get to. As you can see here, the brief was to create an illustration that highlights the contrast between Christmas shopping in a store versus Christmas shopping online. Now, they wanted to emphasize this point that the image should feature the threat posed by digital to traditional brick and mortar business. The article that this illustration was meant to accompany hadn't been finished yet, so I couldn't actually read what the author was saying. But through conversations with the art director, we had a general idea of what we were looking to do. The first thing was to come up with some ideas. This was the first sketch that I drew in Photoshop. As you can see, it's fairly rough, but I eventually did refine that. But you can see here that it was just a simple idea of people ignoring the brick and mortar shops as they purchased packages delivered by drones. I really liked this idea, and I spent a bit of time thinking about the composition. But for every project that you'll ever do commercially, you'll always be asked to produce at least a couple of ideas. Given the tight deadlines, I wanted to come up with at least one more solid idea to present to the magazine's art directors. For the second idea, I had a small thumbnail sketch off in the corner of my initial sketch. The first one with two people, one representing an online shopper and one representing an in-store shopper. But I also drew a package, one that was wrapped in pretty paper in a bow and one that looked like it was in a cardboard box ready to be shipped. Because I wanted to highlight the contrast between these two elements, I liked presenting the imagery this way as a literal division between the two ideas. I liked the idea of focusing on the packaging, but I still liked having the people in the sketch. So this led me to develop this sketch, where on the one side you see a person with an iPad checking the boxes as they go by on a conveyor belt. And on the left-hand side, you see someone looking through a store window at the lovely, festively decorated Christmas packages. I felt this was a strong secondary idea, although I still preferred the first one. But these are the two sketches I presented the following day. Well, as it was, the art directors came back that it was in fact this one. This happens more often than not, I would say, that art directors often choose your second favorite idea. But as an illustrator, you have to go with it. As I considered this one for a cover, though, I realized that having the two people on either side of the package didn't help the composition. Having the two people on either side of the package pulled focus away from what I wanted to be the focal point, which was the package in front. So I redrew this rough sketch in what I call a tight linear. A tight linear is, as you can imagine, just a linear version of your sketch. I'm not worried about tone or shadow or light here. I am just thinking about the edges of my shapes. But once I'm at this stage, I sent this off for approval. They did agree that they liked the more simplified focal point of this composition. It also left more room down below for them to put some titles and some subheads. And now that I have the tight linear drawing, I'm able to bring this into Adobe Illustrator and begin laying it out. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here I am in my Adobe Illustrator working file. I'm going to open up my layers panel just so that we can see this a bit more clearly. As you can see, I have a sketch layer right here at the very top of my layer stack. I've talked about this process in other videos where I use a sketch as a guide layer for my illustrations. But essentially it means taking my sketch and in the transparency panel, changing the blend mode to multiply and putting it at the top of my layer stack so I can use it to help develop my illustration. For example, this layer, if I isolate it, turn on the sketch, you can see how these shapes were created using the underlying sketch as a basis. And you can see how I'm working almost like watercolor. Each one of these shapes is set to multiply, and by layering them, you build up tone, similar to how you paint with watercolor. Some of these shapes, though, are set to normal so that you're not always building up darker tones. You can develop light over dark as well, as you can see with this highlight. I'm going to zoom out, press Command Z to undo all those. If I come back to my layers panel, you can see just how this illustration was layered. So I zoom in. Each one of these shapes, if I unlock that layer, is just a series of vector shapes. If I turn off the sketch, you can see just how straightforward this is. If I use my white arrow, pull this apart, and you can see just the shapes that go into making that box. Most of these shapes were just created using the pen tool. You can see with the smart guides on, it becomes very easy to create those sort of shapes. Once you have a shape made, you can come here to the gradients panel, make a simple gradient that allows you to finish your box. Again, I'm just going to press Command Z a few times to undo those changes. If I zoom out and turn on some of these other layers, you can see just how some of that depth was created. If I turn all these layers back on, you'll notice that my Illustrator file looks very different from the final illustration. Illustrator, while it is great for making shapes like this, is not particularly good at enhancing the overall image quality like Photoshop is. So from this point here, I imported my Illustrator document into Photoshop. Let's open that up. If you look at the layers in my Photoshop file, you'll notice that most of the color enhancements come through some adjustment layers near the top, as well as a layer here that is set to overlay. If I turn those layers off and zoom out, you can see how this looks very much like the original Illustrator illustration. But I've applied some levels adjustments here on the left-hand side, as well as some color balance on the left-hand side to increase the overall warmth. On the right-hand side, I made the darks darker through a levels adjustment layer, as well as changing the color to something a little bit cooler. But over all of that, I painted some specular glow on a layer here set to overlay blend mode. Primarily, I painted here on the left. Let me zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. Again, the primary objective on the left was to try to enhance the amount of warmth and glow that comes from a shop decorated during the Christmas season. I wanted to increase that by having a warm glow come through the front shop window. With this layer, with a very soft round brush, I've painted in, let me set this to normal just so you can get a sense of what it is that has happened here. And at normal, you can see how I've painted in this glow. In its normal blend mode, though, it doesn't look so hot. But when it's set to overlay, it gives the illusion of a specular highlight. This was the final illustration that I ended up sending to them. I hope you found that informative.